You cannot trust anti-whites who lie and use non-white folk like the Aboriginal peoples and take advantage of them, lie to them, in order to simply further white erasure and anti-white racial discrimination. Do the right thing and be white positive to help the Aboriginal people. Don't use them just to be anti-white. An excellent and clear example of the anti-white narrative and anti-white meme pathogens in Australia, used by and constructed by anti-whites in order to further white erasure and the abuse of innocent members of Western kind, is the anti-white meme pathogen, okay? And this is exactly what it is. And the anti-white meme pathogen of disproportionate deaths of Aboriginals in custody. Okay? Now, as I said in the beginning, the right thing to do is to be white positive and help Aboriginal people. That's what we do as white positive folk. We help all people. We respect and love all folk, no matter their background, and stand against all forms of racial discrimination, including anti-whiteism. Yet, anti-whites would have folk instead use non-white populations for their own benefit, simply to promote anti-white ends. And that is exactly what we see here happening with the Aboriginal community and the lies, the anti-white meme pathogen and lies about disproportionate Aboriginal deaths in custody. Now, as of 2016, Aboriginals, yes, were 14.7 times more likely to die in prison. But is this disproportionate deaths in custody? No. Why? Because Aboriginals make up roughly 30% of prisons in Australia. Now, I'm not here to discuss whether that's justified or not, and I do believe that a lot of that has to do with a loss of culture, a loss of way, a loss of connection to their elders, their way of life, their tribal ways, which leads to criminality. In the same way that we see increased criminality and drug addiction, etc., in the white population now, because of our stolen generation of Western kind, which is enforced with white guilt and anti-white abuse, white erasure. So, I understand Aboriginal erasure does obviously, it does explain, it can be used to soften and justify the situation in a sense, okay? It will allow us to be more compassionate towards Aboriginal people and their plight, and be more understanding, because we can look at the Aboriginal erasure that happened to their people, and we can see that that affects a people and makes them express negatively, feel lost, disconnected, and so they're obviously more likely to act out criminally. And again, we can understand this because we can see this now with Western folk, our own people, because of white erasure and anti-white bigots pushing the same type of thing on our people, the same erasure that happened to the Aboriginal people. So, yes, it's a fact that 30% of the prisons in Australia are made up of Aboriginal people. Is that their fault? No, I don't think so. I don't honestly think it is. I think there's a lot more to it. But it is a fact of the matter, in this current day and age, that 30% of all prisons in Australia, roughly 30% of inmates, are Aboriginal. But Aboriginals only make up about 2 to 3% of the whole Australian population. So the disproportionality is not deaths in custody. The disproportionality is incarceration. And the reason is Aboriginal erasure that has destroyed their people and their way of life, their culture, who they are. But anti-whites don't want you to help Aboriginal people. Anti-whites don't care about non-whites. They pretend and use non-whites as collateral damage in order to further white erasure. There's the same Aboriginal erasure that is the reason why Aboriginals are disproportionately incarcerated. They don't disproportionately die. They're actually less likely to die in prison now because, again, they make up 2% of the population, but they make up around 30% of inmates. So instead of anti-whites telling you the truth, that Aboriginals don't actually die in prison at disproportionate rates, they're actually the least likely people to die now in prison. And they always were just the same. There's never been any bias. The Aboriginals have never been picked out or targeted in prison. It's just a fact of the matter. If 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 3 people in a place are Aboriginal, well, every time somebody there dies, 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 of those people who die in that place where 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 of those people are Aboriginal, when they die, 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 3 will be Aboriginal still. Their race isn't going to change when they die. So there's no disproportionate deaths. There should be more Aboriginal deaths in prison if it's equal and races aren't being targeted. There's no discrimination because there is more Aboriginals in prison. That's just mathematics. And I'm not saying it should, nobody should be dying in prison at all, regardless of their race. We need to fix the whole system. It's not about race. But that's the other thing as well. The anti-whites know that if we don't talk about the actual system, the problem itself, then it won't change. Nothing can be fixed and innocent people will still be dying in prison. And anti-whites think that's awesome. And what does that mean? That means more Aboriginals will die in prison. And the anti-whites want that. They promote that. So the anti-whites are using Aboriginal people, lying to them, saying that they're more likely to die in prison, which will make them more likely to die in prison. That's what is actually leading to the deaths of Aboriginals and all other races of folk in prison. This anti-white lie that it's disproportionate Aboriginal deaths. That's what's actually now causing the deaths in prison of all inmates. Trying to stop the Aboriginal deaths and the disproportionate deaths of Aboriginals and making it all about race. Which is what the anti-whites are doing. Instead of telling you the truth, that there's no disproportionate deaths at all, it's disproportionate incarceration. There's more Aboriginals being arrested and put in jail than other people. It's not that they're dying more, it's just that there's more of them being put there. So that's the issue. But again, the anti-whites don't want you to look at the real problem and actually help the Aboriginal people. Alright? Because that would make you have to look at the Aboriginal erasure. The actual cause of the problem. Why they're more likely to commit crimes. Because they're a lost people. They've been erased. But if you look at that and you actually start to heal and help the Aboriginal people and do the right thing and be white positive and understand their erasure and the harm of erasure of a folk, well, that would also make you have to stand against white erasure and the anti-whites themselves. Because you can't be compassionate and care about the erasure that happened to the Aboriginal people and then just ignore the current erasure of our people as well. But if you just ignore the erasure of the Aboriginal people, then you can ignore the erasure of white folk that's happening today. And that's what the anti-whites want. They want us to not focus on white erasure. the harm that they're doing to our folk in all Western nations all across the world. And so instead of allowing us to actually help and heal the Aboriginal people that went through their erasure, they would rather us just ignore it and pretend like it's not it's not something to focus on, make up other anti-white lies which will further white erasure. So ignore the erasure of the Aboriginal people, don't help them heal, lie to them, use them to then help create that same erasure, the same damage and harm and suffering that Aboriginal people in another group of people. And then once the anti-whites are done with that, they'll move on to another group and dehumanize that group and erase them of their culture until they've erased every people on the planet of their culture and way of life and just jammed us into big cogs in their globalist tyrannical machine of consumerism and debt slavery, fiat currency and banking. Okay? So, at the end of the day, if you want to do the right thing, if you want to actually help the Aboriginal people, if you have a heart, you have some compassion, and you care that a whole people, a whole population of folk have been removed from their roots like a tree being cut down, erased. And now they're doing the same thing to us as white folk, taking down our statues, trying to make us multicultural and diverse. It's white erasure. It's the same thing that happened to the Aboriginals. That was Aboriginal erasure. And it's the reason why they're disproportionately incarcerated still till this day. And Aboriginals will still be dying in incarceration until people are going to focus on the actual root of the cause, which is the lack of connection to their way of life, their people, their culture, Aboriginal erasure, and the erasure of folks' culture in general. So yes, that includes white erasure, addressing anti-whiteism, and being white positive. And this is probably the core, at the moment at least, of the anti-white narrative, the main thread that's holding it all together. So if we can pull this thread out, the whole anti-white narrative in Australia should unravel and come undone. And then we can actually start to stop the erasure of folk and their connection to their race, their culture, their way of life, their tribal existence, and actually start healing each other and working together to make the world a better place. Get down the crime rates. Give people a purpose and meaning to live for their folk, their next generation, to uphold their culture, their ways. Something that they can actually do instead of going out and being disproportionately incarcerated. Take it easy, folks. And remember, do the right thing. Help all people of all races by being white positive. Don't lie and manipulate and try to use non-whites and harm non-whites like the Aboriginal peoples, simply to promote white erasure with lies like the anti-white meme pathogen of disproportionate Aboriginal deaths in custody, which has never existed. Thank you. Take it easy.